Hello everybody and welcome back to a new video, and today is a super exciting video. It's one of my favorite ones to film each year. It's also, I guess, one of the ones that I find the most daunting. I'm always very intimidated about filming this video, about putting it together, and that is my top 10 books over the past year. So my top 10 books of 2022. Now when I say top 10, I'm talking about just fiction books. I do have two nonfiction books that I am going to talk about separately. I'm actually going to do those first. So this year is a reading goal of mine to read at least one nonfiction book each month. I almost succeeded. I think I counted up, I read 10 nonfiction books this year, and obviously there's 12 months in a year, so there were 2 months in there where I forgot to read one, but out of the 10, I had a lot of good ones, but I did have two very standout ones. So the first one was Know My Name by Chanel Miller. This is a memoir. Chanel Miller was the victim in the Brock Turner Stanford swimmer rape trial. Chanel Miller takes us starting from the night of the crime that happened, and then all the way up through the trial over the course of multiple years. I think that this was just a super impactful memoir. Chanel really delves deep into the emotional impact that this had on both her and her family. She covers kind of the victim blaming that she had to deal with between the media taking over her case, and how the media got a hold of it very, very fast before she was even able to really tell many of her family members that it had happened to her. People were reading about it in the news. Chanel really goes through how traumatic not only the event itself was, but then having to relive it over and over and over again throughout the course of her trial, and kind of showcases why many women do not take their rape cases to trial. They don't tell anybody because it is a very traumatic event. It's also very, very expensive. And I think Chanel just really covered a lot of bases about sexual assault victims and how society views them and how they're handled in the courts, how there are many very good resources for them, but also how the justice system is very unjust towards them, and how we have a lot of improvement to make in handling those types of cases. I highly, highly recommend listening to the audiobook. Chanel narrates it herself, and I think listening to her actually read the words that she has written just adds so much more power to them. This is a very, very emotionally heavy book. I cried multiple times while listening to it, so I highly recommend you reading it, but also going into it at a time where you're kind of in a more, I guess, stable, comfortable mindset, because it is such a heavy book and does take an emotional toll on the reader, but it is one that I highly recommend. So the other nonfiction book that I read over the course of this past year that I wanted to talk about as one of my favorites was Dark Archives, a librarian's investigation into the science and history of books bound in human skin. This is by Rosenbloom, and from the get-go, I was absolutely enthralled with this. It's rather short. It's under 300 pages, but there is a lot covered in this, from just kind of the, like it says, history and science behind books bound in human skin, and it's a very niche topic, but it's very, very fascinating. It really debunks a lot of myths behind books bound in human skin. It covers the science of how books are tested to see if they are truly bound in human skin or not, and just the various histories of both the victims and the people that did the binding. It was just really, really interesting. So if this is kind of a niche topic that you are just curious about, I highly recommend picking this book up, or if you're just looking for a very unique kind of historical topic, I would check this out. And now into my top 10 fiction books for the past year, 2022. I am not ordering these in like 10, 9, 8 up to my like top favorite one. I'm really bad about doing that. The best I can do is narrow it down to my top 10. I have a hard time like ranking them inside that top 10. So what I'm going to do is I'm going through these in the order that I read them over the course of the year. So it's not like least favorite to most favorite, it's just the order I read them January through December, and that's the order that they will show up in this list. So the first book in this list is actually the first book that I read at the beginning of 2022, and that is Middle Game by Sean and McGuire. I remember when I read this, I said that if this does not show up in my top 10 list, I will be shocked, and lo and behold, it is here. This is another book that I was just absolutely enthralled with, and like that's the case with all of these books, obviously, because they're my top 10 favorites of this year. But I remember just being absolutely transported into this kind of like alternate version of our reality, following these twins, Roger and Dodger, who were kind of like, for lack of a better term, mutants. They were born under very, very special circumstances, designed by kind of these, you can think of them as like mad scientist type people, and one of the twins has a kind of strong control over language that grants him a certain kind of like abilities, and then the other has a strong control over mathematics, which then grants a certain type of ability. And we're just following these twins over the course of about 30 years as they kind of get separated, come together, and back and forth, weaving throughout their lives and how they are handling their separations and then times together, as well as their newfound abilities that evolve as they grow up. Not to mention they end up on the run as somebody thinks that they are kind of peaking in their abilities and wants to use them to unlock the keys to the universe. So when they discover that they are kind of being hunted down or followed, they're then on the run. And I just had a lot of fun with this book. I really liked McGuire's writing style in this one, and I felt like Roger and Dodger's relationship as siblings, but as like siblings with this extra sort of like supernatural connection, was very, very interesting and fun to read about. It really propelled my interest throughout the entirety of this story, and really, really made me care for these characters a lot. So I think if you're kind of looking for something similar to Vicious and Vengeful by V.E. Schwab, but at a slower and I guess more academic case and pace, I think you would like this book a lot. So the next book that I have on my list is A Close and Common Orbit by Becky Chambers. This is the second book in the Wayfarers series, and I really, really loved this one. This series is a kind of cozy sci-fi series where it's very, very character focused. The books in the series are kind of loosely linked to one another, but each one kind of follows a different cast of characters that may have been like side characters in the previous book. In this case, in this second book, A Close and Common Orbit, we are following a set of side characters from the first book, and we are following them back in time when they were a child, and then as they grow up. And without really spoiling too much of the first one, I'm not really going to go into the plot of it, but I just found this one to be extremely cozy. I got really attached to our main characters. It's a very kind of isolated environment type of situation. We do follow actually two different timelines. So the first timeline is kind of following that side character as they're a child growing up and figuring out how they got to be where they are in present day, and then in present day we're following that side character as they help kind of a different side character get situated in their very new and different lifestyle that they were kind of forced into. Again, don't want to spoil it, but a lot of this is focused on kind of like, I guess, an individual's sense of like tenacity and survival, as well as forming those very close relationships that kind of give you a reason to move forward and continue living and continue trying in very difficult times. Becky Chambers has a way of just giving these little short one-liners that on their own wouldn't pack much of a punch, but in the context that she puts them in, just really absolutely just strangled my heart. There's just a focus on kind of the idea of like childhood and innocence and the loss of that, but also the idea of like gaining that later in life and gaining a sense of joy later in life. I don't know, there was a lot that went on in this book that it still kept the book very quiet, but yet there was like little moments of intense action that was sprinkled in that was a little different than the first book, and I just really enjoyed this one. And again, the characters really made this story for me, and this ended up being a favorite of mine. So then the third book that I have on my top 10 list is The Death of Jane Lawrence by Caitlyn Starling. Now this is a gothic horror novel, and I think it's one where you can either really love it or you're just gonna think it's nonsense and you're not gonna like it. And I obviously was one that really loved this. So we are following our main character, Jane Lawrence. She is a young single woman who was kind of living with her benefactors who are going to move to this different city, and she doesn't necessarily want to move to that city, and so in order to stay, she realizes that she has to marry, because this is in like the 1800s and a single woman isn't really able to live on her own without causing suspicion. So she ends up striking up a bargain with the town doctor as kind of like a marriage of convenience. It's not really like a marriage of love, it's more of like a business transaction where they will say that they're married in order for her to kind of maintain a sense of independence, kind of. She agrees to kind of keep his books for him, which he needs, so it works out for him. The doctor does have one stipulation, that he will marry her as long as she never steps foot in his family's home. The family home is kind of like out in the country or whatever. It's like this big estate, and he kind of has his own like little doctor's office with an apartment there. So the agreement is that she will just stay at the apartment at the doctor's office and never go back to the family home. And of course things happen, various circumstances, and she ends up at the family home and getting stranded there, and some very strange things start happening there. And this takes a very wild spin on kind of the classic gothic horror story, and I really loved it. It just gets really wacky and really out there, and that's what I really enjoyed about it, because I felt like it really went in places where you didn't expect it to, and it did it without holding back. It really took a lot of risks, I think. I also just really liked Jane as a character. She's this very kind of like logical character that I felt like stayed very consistently logical throughout the entirety of the book. She kind of really thinks through her decisions and thinks through the way other people are acting and why they're acting that way. She kind of has that sense of like understanding, and yeah, I don't know, I really loved how spooky and creepy and atmospheric this was, how wacky it was, and how consistent yet still dynamic Jane's character was. And then the next book on my list is the second book in a 4-book series that I did finish this year, and that is The Arm of the Sphinx by Josiah Braincraft. Like I said, this is the second book in the Books of Babel series. Because I read all 4 this year, I have talked about it ad nauseum on my channel over the last several months. So just a quick recap of what this series is about. We are following Thomas Sutherland. He's a schoolmaster at this small little town, and he gets married to his new wife, Maria, and they decide to celebrate their honeymoon at this big, huge construction called the Tower of Babel. It is this like pinnacle of human ingenuity. It's this giant tower that you can't see the top of, and each floor is considered a kingdom. It's like its own giant city, and each floor has its own very unique set of politics, culture, export, that kind of a thing. And when Thomas and Maria arrive at the Tower of Babel, they very quickly get separated, and so the entirety of this series is Thomas traveling up through the tower in order to reunite with Maria. Obviously, there's a lot more going on as the story progresses. It gets very tangled in the politics and the construction of the tower and the purpose of the tower, but at the base of it, it is Thomas searching for his wife. And I have described this multiple times as if you were to take Bilbo Baggins and drop him in steampunk Alice in Wonderland. This series is very heavy on the steampunk, and on top of that, it's very whimsical, and I think the second book is like the peak of whimsy. Not that the third and fourth books, or even the first book itself, doesn't have that same sense of whimsical feeling, but I think because you start to really learn about the tower in this one, and you go to some very fascinating, interesting places in this one in particular. That's what really made this one my favorite. I think that Braincraft really just let go of the reins here and let his creativity run free, and I was super impressed. I also really enjoyed how our characters really start to delve into kind of their relationships and forming this sense of found family in this book in particular. It's when it really starts to happen, and I think this is just a very unique series. On top of it, the settings are super unique, and just the concept of this giant tower and kind of the side plot of them trying to figure out the whole purpose outside of like just a Tower of Wonders. Like, why else was this tower built? Because it's very clear that there's another reason. And I don't know, I think this is a very unique series, and I had a lot of fun with it, and this one is definitely my favorite out of the series. And then the next book on my list is very different than the other books on this list. Most of them are obviously fantasy and horror novels, and this one is a contemporary novel. It took me by surprise, and that is A Tale for the Time Being by Ruth Ozeki. You know, I actually initially wasn't even gonna ever pick this up. I was at a used bookstore, and Connor found it and said that it sounded like something that I would enjoy. So I agreed when I read the synopsis, and I decided to take a chance on it, and I am so incredibly happy that I did. That being said, this is a very emotionally heavy novel. We are following our main character, Ruth, and she kind of lives in this very rural, foresty town in Canada. It's a very small town, and it's on the coast, and one day she's walking the beach and she finds a Hello Kitty lunchbox that has washed up on the beach, And inside she finds a series of items, including a diary from a young teenage Japanese girl. And so then Ruth thinks that this lunchbox has washed up after the tsunami in 2011 that happened over in Japan. And while she's reading the diary, we kind of flip back and forth between the diaries that are written by the teenage girl now, and then Ruth as she is kind of grappling with her purpose and kind of existence in the world. And kind of how her story and her feelings end up intertwining with Now's very different yet similar experience. And a lot of this gets, like I said, very heavy, but we deal with kind of this sense of extreme loneliness and isolation and kind of how a person handles that. And we also deal with kind of the idea of like your existence in time. There's a lot of kind of philosophical questions that both Now and Ruth kind of are grappling with throughout the entirety of this book. It is a very quiet book, yet a very emotionally loud book, if that makes sense. I think this is another one where you have to be in a pretty good headspace to read, because there are a lot of trigger warnings. There's some very severe bullying, suicidal ideation, and various other things that I would check the trigger warnings before you pick this up. But it is one that really sat with me after I finished it, and I just could not stop thinking about it. I also really appreciated how Ruth, the author, wrote herself into this book. Ruth, the author, is Ruth, the main character, and how she wrote both the good and the ugly sides of her life, and in terms of just like her in her writing career, her in grappling with kind of her existence, her and her husband's marriage, and I don't know, this just really sat with me, like I said, long after I finished it. So the next book on my list is a cozy murder mystery, and that is Finley, Donovan is Killing It by Cimino. This book had me laughing out loud throughout the entirety of the novel. Now, this is the first book in a cozy murder mystery series. I do own the second one, have not read it yet, and the third one is coming out at the beginning of 2023. So in this book, it starts out following Finley Donovan. She is a single mother who is a kind of struggling mystery thriller writer, and she is in a Panera Bread talking with her agent about the plot of her newest novel that she's working on. And so while she's there kind of talking about this, a woman at a table nearby overhears her and mistakes Finley as a hitwoman, and then tries to hire Finley to kill off her husband. And through a series of miscommunication and events, Finley ends up getting involved in this murder mystery where the husband of the woman that was trying to hire Finley does end up dying, and obviously Finley ends up getting very entangled in that. And this book is just, it is so funny. Like I said, had me laughing out loud. It gets really out there, really wacky. It ends up being a very absurd series of events, yet it works so well in this book. You know, each event you're just like, how did that even happen? Yet it still makes sense in the context of the surrounding events. I really loved Finley as a character, as well as the friendship that she ends up developing with her babysitter. There's a lot of discussion of her struggles as a single mom and her struggles kind of dealing with her ex-husband who had cheated on her. It's very interesting to kind of delve into Finley and her struggles as a person, and then it's also interesting to have her in the middle of this murder mystery and trying to figure it out and fix things. And it's just a really fun, wild ride, and I think if you're looking for a really fun cozy murder mystery, I would highly recommend picking this up. And after that, I am cheating a little bit, but it's my video, my list, and I can do what I want. I have not one book, but 3, and that is the Locked Tomb series, or the 3 books that are currently part of the Locked Tomb series. Gideon the Ninth, Harrow the Ninth, and Nona the Ninth. I could not just pick one. I had to showcase all 3 of these. This is a wild, ridiculous, creative, and just genius science fiction series. So this list, I am talking about all 3 of them, but we are just going to talk about how Gideon the Ninth starts. We are in this galactic space empire, and we are following Gideon. She is an indentured swordswoman to the 9th house of this galactic empire. And she ends up being kind of blackmailed, coerced by Harrow, who is the heir to this 9th house. And she needs a swordswoman, a right-hand woman, in order to join this competition that the Emperor of the 9 houses is setting up in order to pick who is going to be part of his elite circle of necromancers. And so Harrow and Gideon end up traveling to this kind of like haunted mansion in space in order to solve a bunch of puzzles, create alliances and enemies among the other 9 houses, their heirs and their swords people, and it just gets really wacky. It's gory, it's hilarious. The ability of Tanzan Muir to write her characters in a very unique and individual sense, but humor throughout each of them is just incredible, as well as her intricate plotting and how each book, but specifically the last 2, Harrow and Nona, are just like this wacky mind puzzle that you're trying to figure out while trying to follow what's even happening in this story. Highly recommend these. They feel super unique, yet pull from various aspects of the science fiction genre, various subgenres, in order to create each story that is just so incredibly fun. And yeah, I think Tanzan Muir has just like a galaxy brain. These are incredible. And then the 8th book on my list is Babel by RF Quan. Are we surprised? I feel like this book is on nearly everybody's top 10 list, if they've read it this past year. So this is a dark academia book, but it feels unlike any other dark academia book that I've ever read. We're following a main character, Robin. He was an orphan from China who gets adopted, I guess. It doesn't feel like an adoption because the adopter is not very fatherly, but he ends up, I guess, being taken in by a guardian who decides to teach him all these like basics to learning languages in order to enroll him later in his life at Oxford's Institute of Language called Babel, where they do this thing called silverworking, where they have these silver bars and they put a word and then its translation on the other side to a different language, and kind of that thing that's lost in translation, the meaning that's lost in the translation, then becomes like an ability that the silver bar can do. But what this book is really about is tackling colonialism and the injustices that white institutions have had over people of color and cultures of color throughout the ages, specifically in this case in the 1800s. Robin is forced to really look at this institution that he loves and that has benefited him, but how detrimental it is to so many other people, so many other countries, so many other cultures. It just really tackles and deconstructs the British Empire and institutional racism, and I just think Quan just knocked it out of the park yet again. She does not pull any punches yet again. This is extremely powerful, and it just really forces you to take a look at the various institutions that you benefit from and how like harmful they really are. There are also footnotes in this, which is really fun and adds to the dark academia atmosphere. This is a very atmospheric book on top of a very hard-hitting novel, tackling a lot of hard-hitting topics, and I really enjoy this. The end was another one that just punches you in the gut, yet it almost can't end any other way, just as in The Burning God, and I just really enjoyed this. And then after that, I have You Let Me In by Camilla Bruce. This is kind of a fantasy horror novel. We are following the story of our main character, Cassandra Tipp, and in the present day, she has been missing for over a year and is presumed dead, and so her niece and nephew are kind of inheriting her estate, yet when they get there, they find a manuscript on her desk. She was a very famous author, and inside it says that they have to read kind of the truth behind a couple of different very dark events that happened in her life. She was tried but acquitted for the disembowelment of her husband, and then there's also the murder-suicide of her father and brother that people think that she was somehow related in. And so this manuscript is telling kind of her truth of what happened during these events, but it really follows the course of from when she was a little girl up through right before she disappeared, and kind of the various circumstances that led to the pinnacle dark events that kind of followed her throughout her life, but various other things as well. This is an extremely dark novel. This is another one that I would look up trigger warnings for if you have any sort of trauma in your life, because this is full of traumatic events. But what I really loved about this was not only how just hauntingly beautiful Bruce's writing style is, but how Bruce really took this idea of like altering versions of what happened and you forcing the reader to accept all of the versions as truth. A lot of times I feel like when you have like one version of the truth, another version of the truth, and so on, there's one like in particular that the reader is supposed to take as the true version of the truth, but in this case you are really forced to accept that each version is the truth, if that makes sense. And I found it very unique. Kind of fantastical elements of this story are dark but gorgeous and very atmospheric as well. This is another book that just like really latched itself onto me and surprised me with how impactful it was long after I read it. And then the last book that I have in my top 10 list of 2022 is This Thing Between Us by Gus Moreno. This is another horror novel, and it is another one that kind of deals with trauma and grief. We are following our main character who has just lost his wife in a very horrific accident, and we're basically following him as he deals with the grief of losing her. It's told almost through like one long letter to his dead wife, and kind of like how he's coping with her being gone, but also how he is recounting events that happened when they were alive and how they seem to link to things that are now happening after she is passed. They had this little like house where it seemed to be very haunted, Weird things were happening, random packages were showing up that had very strange items in them. There were cold spots, they would hear things in the walls, but what was particularly creepy is they took like a version of an Elcia and had very creepy, like possibly possessed things happening with this smart house device, and it was very, very creepy. And then things start happening post his wife's death that end up causing him to kind of move out into this cabin in the middle of nowhere, thinking that if he leaves the house he will leave all of that weird haunting stuff behind, but obviously something has followed him to the cabin and things are just escalating from there. And I think that this is like one of the creepiest haunted house stories that I've ever read. It's also very interesting having the grief aspect intertwined within it, and then there's this sort of cosmic horror that ends up getting involved as well, and I think that just all of those elements together were done so well. I loved Moreno's writing style and how it is a very casual writing style in terms of our main character is writing this letter to his dead wife, but I think it was done so incredibly well. Not to mention just the very specific hard-hitting moments of just this grief punching our main character in the gut and thus punching the reader in the gut. It got just very sad and hard to read at times, but on top of that, this is an incredibly creepy story. You often don't know what's going on for much of it, yet I think the way that that is kind of explained within the story is done really well. I think it fits really well, and I loved the cosmic horror elements to it, and this was just really, really good. So those are my top 10 books of 2022 on top of my 2 nonfiction mentions that I wanted to talk about. I'm not going to hold them up because it's a very big stack, but I think that all of these are great and you should read all of them because I loved them all. If you've read any of these books, please let me know down in the comments below, or if you're looking to read any of them, I'd love to hear about that too. Let me know what some of your favorite books from this past year were, and if I should read any of them, if you think I'd like any of them. But thank you so much for watching this video. I hope you consider sticking around and subscribing if you haven't already. But as always, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye!